Welcome back. I'm going to hand off the stage quite swiftly because I think a lot of us are really, really excited to hear Ben talk about building internal alignment with other teams. So I'm actually just going to hand over the stage, and at the end of this, we'll have some time for Q&A. Oh, yes, yes.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming for my talk. Just a quick agenda. I'm going to run through the usuals of who am I, a bit of what is DevRel, because we keep answering the same questions over and over again, a bit about challenges, who we align ourselves to within our own organizations, a bit about company life cycles, and kind of what matters to these different companies. Now, anyone who's known me before will kind of recognize this slide. There is indeed a pun warning. This one is less funny than usual, and sadly, not as many puns as usual, mostly because this is a shorter talk than I normally give. So, quick thing about who I am. These days, I kind of go by technology sommelier at Ivan. My job is to pair your open source Kafka, your open source Postgres, maybe some cheese and some wine along the way, mostly to make ourselves feel better about it all. But I've worked on a bit of everything, and I do mean almost everything, from medical device development with kind of diagnostics to MMO games to all kind of things in between. I even managed to start an augmented reality company on Google Glass about almost over 10 years ago now, because we're now all old. And I do make more crustacean jokes in Rust than I should do, because why not if you've got a cute crab logo? And to that end, what is Ivan? And Ivan is where I work today. And hands up who knows what this is, by the way. This is a picture of. So this is the Crab Nebula, a famous fun thing in the night sky. And this is Rapu, the Ivan Crab logo, if you can see it, and 7 of his favorite 11 open source friends. We host open source software for people so that they have a nice platform to access with one developer experience, one SLA, a damn simple build, because we're way too lazy to make complicated billing. I do actually mean that, because that requires more development than we wanted to admit. And the real thing here is that the stars are the limit with open source data tools. Yes, the pun was intended. So, through that ado, what is DevRel? And we'll have heard lots of answers today. And in general, what we tend to find is that it is different things to different people. Hands up who's seen this meme before. By the way, there'll be a decent amount of interaction. I'm trying to get a bit of a gauge across of things, because generally, part of the problem here is DevRel is different things. And we have to kind of engage the fact that we do so many different things. But the thing about this meme is, it kind of died, right? That whole thing of what DevRel was died in about February 2020, when everything stopped. And that kind of attitude that we're the people who fly around the world doing things which no one can really attribute, that just burning money away in the background, has entirely died now. Right? The tide has gone out on that whole behavioral kind of modality. And although we'd love to be able to say we just get to go places and do things, I don't think the people who hold our budget strings will let us do that anymore. Some people in my old team remember when this started happening. Yes, you remember, don't you? Yeah, and this is the kind of problem we're actually facing right now. So what DevRel is keeps changing, because there are even books that say what DevRel is. Hell, some of them even have references from me in them, which is incredibly strange, to me at least. And what you'll generally find out, though, over time is that there are many different things. And I want to kind of stress this point, that DevRel is not one thing anymore. It has broadened and broadened as more and more companies needed it for more and more different types of products. There are people who sell APIs. There are people who sell SDKs. There are people who just open source software for people to use. There are car companies who want people to bring apps to their platforms. There are people whose job it is just to bring ecosystems together. And what this basically means is that there is no one story anymore that fits. And relating to developers is a series of skills, and it looks like one thing until you actually have to dig any level of depth into it and realize we do lots of different things for lots of different peoples, even if we're on the same team. So let's talk about some of our biggest challenges here. And the first one is this problem of a huge remit. We generally tend to own far more than we want to, because we are relatively omni-skilled people. You start with a bunch of people who know how to code normally, and then you add on the ability to talk to people, which those two don't often go together. It's actually a weirder skill than it looks like at first glance. And when you go to one of those conferences, which is mostly just people who do mainline development, you realize very quickly what it means to be able to talk professionally and develop professionally at the same time. And go on to that, you then have to add the ability to write coherently, to talk coherently at length, and the ability to create accessible content. So you have this ridiculously huge remit, combined with a lot of very hard skills here. We have to be very good at what we do to make other people allowed to access it. Because if we can't answer the question we're asked, we generally lose credibility pretty fast. And we're there to bring credibility to whatever we're doing. We can learn in public, yes, but we still have to answer the core questions of why does this exist? What does it do? How do we make it work? Because if we don't, it kind of like asks the wrong questions of what we want to do. The next thing here is tough lagging metrics. In general, everything we do has some level of lag to it, even if it's a single day in some cases, but more often than not, we're talking months to quarters to years here. And particularly, as kind of Wesley mentioned this morning, it's about looking at that kind of full time horizon of we are really like looking to try and get long-term impact versus that kind of short-term rewardism. And that kind of doubles down into this perception problem. We are perceived to be one thing, whereas we are often many different things. So are we developers? A lot of people look snootily at us and say no. I would hard argue that most of us are developers. However, I'd also argue that most of us don't need to be developers. And it's that kind of split thing of where we are perceived to be a version of our role which lives in someone else's head. And this means we end up with this kind of dichotomy of what we can do, what we could do, and what we should do are three different things. And this is where the last and biggest challenge comes in, which is this perception of ROI, return on investment. We are quite an expensive team, nearly always, and we have things to do, and therefore any team in any organizations needs to show a return on the investment put into it. This is just the sad reality of the corporate hellscape we live in. This is late-stage capitalism. As much as I'd love to change that one, that is one of the few things I kind of have to assume at the start of this, right, is we're in late-stage capitalism, them be the bricks. Let's make it as least bad as it can get. So, with that kind of ado, let's borrow a meme and kind of about where the problems kind of come in. Oh, sorry, I've clicked too many times. And this is a kind of a meme from yesteryear again, which is, we'll just copy people, try it, but then someone's going to try and call us to account because they're like, hey, you're just buying people beer. What are you doing this for? You're just running meetups. Are you just having crowds of your friends around to do what you want? It's like, we dream of doing this. We dream of doing this. If we could get away with it, yes, but it doesn't work, so we don't. Because on average, we are here we have integrity. We have enough integrity to know that if it doesn't work, we probably won't keep doing it. So this might have happened once or twice, but this is a perception problem again of things we are perceived to do. Like we appear to host big parties and do cool stuff without seeing the logistical nightmare which it is to book a venue at short notice for a number of people as yet undetermined. And when you start dealing with all these problems one after another, you realize that actually running a meetup is far harder than shipping a software project. I will take one over the other any day of the week, and have repeatedly. Don't get me wrong, meetups work, which is the most depressing thing, is that they actually do work. They do cause ROI. If they didn't, we might not have to do them anymore. It's like cold calling. It's depressing that it works. So why worry about alignment? Well, other than the kind of fact of if we don't have alignment against things, other people are worried about it too. So let's roll back to 2017 in DevRelCon and what leadership wants from Ray Bango. And the fact is, some of this should sound quite familiar to what I've just mentioned. Right? I found this after I started writing this talk and was like, yes, validation. It's not just me. The first thing to do is check you're not the crazy person. And then kind of more recently, there was this video that came out last week. So quick hands up, who's seen this video, by the way? About, let's say, half to a third of the room, right? So I reached out to Ali and asked if I could actually reference this, and she was pretty happy with this, me talking about it. And she kind of lists a series of points, and I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail because it's quite current in our space. And it's quite important to hit certain issues, I think, because if it's the current talked about point, I want to reference it. So she references about 10 points, of which these are kind of a subtle summary of. Some of them break down into multiple things, but this is the kind of the headline she had as the key bullet points. And just to highlight a few here, these ones are the ones I'll highlight as kind of direct alignment type issues. It's hard to measure what we do because we're not aligned against metrics the company fully understands. We measure things, we all do, we have to, but if they're not what other people are measuring, is that really going to be useful to us? There's a cargo cult type reason to hire DevRel. Hands up here who's in a venture-funded startup? Who here is in a private company, which is not actually public yet? And who here is in a large public company? So actually quite an even spread, to be honest, which is quite interesting because the metrics change depending on where you are quite a lot. At a small venture-funded place, particularly pre-kind of Series B, you have very different metrics to those people in the late-stage world like me, where it's like, hey, you're heading to an IPO train here, you've got to show these numbers, to post-IPO of, you're really talking about positioning more than anything else, or trying to just create enough buzz to keep things going. It's a very different game again. And the other thing that kind of came out of the video was this, these blue ones. Now, these are kind of alignment against what you want. So these are what I would call not internal alignment, but intrinsic alignment. Are you aligned to what DevRel is really doing? Is what you're doing aligned to what you want? Now, this is one of the things I'm not going to go into too much detail about, but just to quickly hit on it, there's a certain point of where if the DevRel team you're hired onto has no clear remit, you're not going to know what you do when you walk in the door. This is going to be problematic because there is no way to align against no remit. If you don't know what you're measured on, you can't hit those outcomes. You will always end up in this kind of positive problem where you cannot win because you do not know why you are there. They do not know why you are there. There is no easy plan to success. And hands up who's seen this kind of 5 dysfunctions of teams slide. So this is me being a management consultant from long ago, kind of talking the corporate nonsense we used to talk about for silly amounts of money and not get paid it. And yes, it's very fun watching the partners get paid, and at the bottom of the tree, you just talk this stuff. But the key thing here is that like you see these dysfunctions happen when you have this kind of ambiguity and low standards applied and an absence of trust where you get brought in, you just get given the thing you should be doing, like make community happen, is a line I have literally been told more often than I want to admit, right? Like, grow us a developer community, get us customers, do this, do that. And I'm like, with what? And for what purpose? And the answer is reasons. These kind of things happen in these kind of dysfunctional teams. And high performance is a misnomer, but this is the official thing, so I'm just going to use it as is for now. So you get this problem where if you can't have certain levels of like alignment, and the key one here is the attention to results, which is kind of what I'm using as a proxy to alignment, because you have to align against a result that matters to the people who actually hold either the purse strings or at least you're actually reporting up to. So who do we align to? So just a quick show of hands. Who here reports up to product? A few people. Who reports up to marketing? Who reports up to sales? Awesome. I want to talk to you afterwards. I'd love to hear your story. It's not that I think it's going to be bad. I just want to actually hear it because it's rare. Everyone keeps talking about it as a thing, but I've not seen it very often. Though I have reported to sales before. Also, who reports up to engineering out of interest? Cool. Also want to speak to you. This is the first time I've actually run into people who report to engineering. And who's somewhere in between? We need support more often anyway. So what influences and drives these folks? So when you start talking from a corporate level down, like the things they want to do come from books like this, right? They want to move numbers from 0 to 1. They want to show big steps forward. And they read books like this to communicate how to build decks, right? Barbara Minto was famously of the McKinsey School of Thought. This is something called the Pyramid Principle. Actually a really good book to read if you're building lots and lots of slide decks. I don't recommend building lots of slide decks, but if you have to, genuinely a pretty good book. But it also shows how these kind of corporate ideals are laid out and how the thought processes behind them are structured. Anyone who's worked with me before has probably heard me talk about this stuff before at length. Yeah, you know. And the other thing they do read a lot of is things like this. This is what they try to achieve. This kind of crossing the chasm is kind of the archetypical marketing and sales manual of the day. It's not bad. I don't particularly like a lot of its ideas, but it's kind of useful to know about what people are actually driven by and those things that drive them. And here's the critical one. Who here has an OKR to meet? Who here has had an OKR to meet, at least in the last couple of roles? Yep. This is the book that drove it all. And it's really like the most important thing this book says is on the front page. Everything beyond that, I believe, is superfluous. It is one of those, has the best TLDRs ever. And like the rest of the book is basically just telling you how not to write things down. Say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. This is my actual standby summary of the whole book. So what that means is, though, is that these people have different books to us. their mindsets are not in the same place we're at. And if we're not going to speak the same language they're going to, and we don't have the same words to describe things, we are going to struggle to get our message across, right? We're going to struggle to line up against them, because if they're saying, I need to see a return on investment on EBITDA on Q3 so that we can hit some earnings projection, and that is a little alien to you, or you don't know where you contribute to that, you're going to go, okay, but I just enabled 5.5 more million developers. And they go, and what does that mean to this number? And you're going to go, problematic. And that's not to say we can't have an answer to that, but it is to say that we need to be aware that if we're answering the wrong questions, we're going to end up in a very bad place. So let's look a bit about the company lifecycle here. So this is a kind of a very, very simplified version of the company lifecycle, but it kind of has a kind of couple of key points here, which is that you develop, you go out to the wild, you grow, you mature, and ideally you don't decline. But late stage capitalism says things happen and it's not fun, because growth is a must. If you're not growing, you're declining, because steady states aren't allowed anymore. But it's a sad fact. And back to that kind of venture-funded thing, this is a kind of a little projection of what's happened recently when it comes to funding. And it mirrors the actual economy pretty closely, because venture funding is used as a kind of way to peg how pension funds are doing, because that's where they put a lot of their money. And if the pension funds are declining like this, that pretty much means the economy is just slowing down, which means there's less money to be got for everybody. Now, what this means is we're artificially being pushed to this decline box in the corner, which leads to this drive to reinvent. And who here has had artificial change forced on what they're trying to do in the last few months because of perceived slowdown? Or, oh no, things are going wrong, we must do more of things. And I'm using generic terms here because it's pretty hard to tell what they want us to do next, but inevitably it is not what we've done before, or it's what we've done before faster with less resource. And this is kind of like a running theme when your leadership do not really have a handle on product market fit, or do not have a handle on why growth is slowing down, or are beholden to funders who don't care. The big one is being beholden to funding people who don't care. And this is actually very important to understand. If your startup or scale-up is basically backed by certain types of funds, you are often going to be in this state regardless if you know it or not. There's very little way to avoid it, but it basically means that you have to try extra hard to make sure that any metrics you give are clearly shown to be valuable. We'll talk a bit more about what those are in a minute. So, and this is where we go. How should we measure ourselves? So the real problem here is that we have many different metrics. We should be measuring as many as we can get away with. So who here measures page views on their various web properties? Right? Most of the room, yeah? So Google Analytics, whatever else, that's good. It definitely gives us an impression of how some of the things we're doing work. Who here measures signups? Most of the room again? Yeah. Does most people work in like some sort of SaaS software level stuff? Yes? Or APIs or some equivalent with sign-up equivalents? Cool. I definitely recommend measuring those because they mean a little bit more than page views, though it does depend heavily on what metric you care about most. And then activations, yep. And this is just a Datadog screen because inevitably these live somewhere else in your system, because an activation is also a number of thresholding problems. And what you consider to be an activation will rapidly change how people view you, because we have a free tier, and free tiers are lovely until they cost too much money. And this is one of the ever classic dichotomies of, do we run a free tier? Do we accept the fact that we now have users who are actively costing us money rather than making us money? Will they make us money in the long tail? Who knows? Because very few people have ever done the math on this. In my previous company, when I was CTO, I killed our free tier for this exact reason. It was great for attracting smaller customers. We got some return on investment, but over time we realized it rapidly became a sink to maintain. And it turned out to be the only kind of way we could ever survive was to flip our whole business model to only focus on the top 5 companies in our space as our target customers. Fundamentally, free tiers cost money. Activated users might be a good metric, but it also can mean they're going to cost you even more money in the long term. So if you're just growing a big community of people who don't pay you money, are you just creating a problem which is going to bite you even harder down the line? This is something to be aware of because every single customer who's not a paying customer costs you money. In free-to-play games, this is the kind of whales and minnows mentality where you are basically carried by 5% or less of your whole kind of consumer base. And what this means is that If you need the large population to support the small population, this is a great metric. But as soon as these things go out of whack, or you don't have a way to check if this is true, you're going to end up with a simple fact of someone's going to come round at the end of some quarter or year and say, how much are you burning on AWS resource or equivalent to support these people who you don't have an answer for? And if you've been attracting them for a long period of time, it looks like you've built up this lovely long tail of useful people, but actually they're a net negative. And they're already happy with what you've got. There's no way to monetize them anymore because you've trained them to think it's free. And there are various companies have this problem. So, I'm actually on time. Nice. So, I did not expect that. So the next thing here, and the scariest one, is revenue. Does anyone have a strict revenue target? Now, I don't recommend necessarily having a strict one, but in Salesforce is where most companies end up measuring everything somewhere. Right? We are all accountable to Salesforce, whether we like it or not, eventually. It almost seems like everyone eventually reports to Salesforce, regardless of who you are or what company you're at. So secretly, the CEO of Salesforce seems to run the world. It does feel that way at times, but hey, the important point to note about Salesforce is every single one of the activities that the company does eventually roll up here, and a report will be generated, which will determine the fate of half of the organization, one way or the other. If you don't have a handle on what that means, you often will end up in the dark to know what you're actually trying to achieve. And this is one of those pieces to align on. And who here has internet points calculated? So I'm counting common room and things like this as internet points. Because one, community score is fundamental, in our world, is basically internet points, because that's what we count. And it's an amalgamation score. And it's important, don't get me wrong, but how it quantifies is very kind of dependent on what a community is worth to you, and if it's even worth activating to begin with. So we are measured by all of these things, because of leadership will look down and say, well, that's a hard number, that's a hard number, that's a hard number. Did it go up and to the right? And if the answer is yes, did it go up and to the right hard enough? Did it tie into something down the line that mattered to them? And if you don't control that narrative, someone else will control it for you. And it's not, you don't have to be able to understand every single number all the way through. You don't need to understand corporate accounting. But it is very much worth understanding that if something is going wrong, you need to be aware of it quickly. Because most often than not, it's not directly something you can control, or even spin to your favor. But you do need to be aware of it. So we have to be able to attribute success. So let's talk about alignment again. So in product, there are loads of things we can do. We align against friction logs, we align against use case examples, we align against ideas in the backlog, and numerous other things. We basically become the thing that tells product where to go next, because we're out there trying it with people. And the other point here is developer experience and developer relations are two different things. And they do not quite equal each other. We often end up doing both, and that is a mistake, because they're two separate roles which require more people. And if you end up doing both roles yourself, you're going to be split, and your metrics are going to split badly. And it means half the time you're reporting on marketing outcomes, half the time you're reporting on strict user score metrics, and you'll end up with metrics that do not make sense. In marketing, it's actually a bit more simple. You make content, you raise awareness. I'm using MQLs here because that's what they'll count. And analyst relations and things like this are actually something we are really helpful for because we have that user experience. We are customers of this product. We have tried it, we have used it, we have felt it. We've often tried what the competitors are doing because if we don't know what else is out there, we can't even form an informed opinion. And we're there to make that storytelling piece real. The other big thing is they can promote our stuff, right? If they're going to be sending out mailers with content on it, put our stuff in there. It's often better than what they're writing, at least in my opinion, right? If you're going to send out SDRs, give them content you're not ashamed of, right? We don't want to ruin community spirit by sending out substandard stuff because we are the ones who will feel it. So make sure we're actually getting the people on our side and getting them online with us, along with us aligning with them. Now, for sales, we end up being the truth sayers, right? I love working on sales calls because I get to be there specifically for the customer, not the rep. A line I've said many times is, I'm here to make sure the rep doesn't get too happy. And I've said that a lot of times because my job is to be the absolute truth sayer in the conversation. I'm happy to send them away as long as I can send them to the right place. Doesn't matter where you are. It all works out quite nicely if everyone's happy. And engineering, my main thing here is to be the angry first customer. We're there to kick the tires to make sure no one else gets hurt. Shipping code is not your goal. Combined, it ends up looking like a funnel, but not one of these. It's more like one of these. So this is the customer success funnel, but we slice away the outside and rule out some sales, cut away decision making, and onboarding we have sales engineers for. Because you got to understand your funnel, because that's what's going to drive us. We live at the very top and the very bottom. We enable people, we bring people in, and understand our company objectives. If we're venture funded or inside large behemoths, you have to understand where you're going and what you're actually reporting up to. Because what is DevRel at the end of the day? It's many things, potentially too many things, but definitely too many things to do on our own. And that's the key point here is we have to align because we have to be part of the team to succeed. Thank you.
Awesome talk. We have 5 minutes for questions. Does anyone have one? There's a question here.
Thank you for your talk. Yeah, anyway, thank you for your talk. You talked about getting rid of your free tier. How did that change what DevRel was doing once you took the free tier out? And do you have advice for folks in that space?
When I did this, I was the founding CTO of the company. We had the equivalent of one person working in DevRel. We retasked them entirely to basically product marketing. Very technical product marketing at that. Like it was literally write technical material to demonstrate how to integrate this stuff, show why it's a cool thing. I often think that product marketing and DevRel are often two sides of the same coin. You basically sometimes do one thing, sometimes do the other. If you do it really, really well, you can pretend to be either. But in general, what happens is we need specialists these days because of everything has become increasingly pointed. So that although I occasionally get asked if I want to move to product marketing internally, very strange times right now, I know, but that it is the sort of thing where there is a definite overlap between the two roles, at least in some companies. Others really doesn't make sense.
Thank you for an excellent, really important talk, I think. One of the things is that I think from the other talks that I heard today is that people may have to involve some of the really important kind of potential routes for surviving, you know, in today's kind of environment, like pivoting from, one of those things to maybe product if sales is getting their marketing slashed or their budget is getting slashed or whatever. So we have to be flexible. I think that's one of the very important outcomes of these things that you've presented today. One of the other things I find is particularly in large companies who should know better is how to build actual understanding amongst basically people who should know better. I mean, even in companies where the core product is either software, content, data, delivered programmatically, how to actually make people at the top really understand the importance of it, and people who are not native. I mean, personally, I think they shouldn't be in position, but they are.
So this is the ever classic, often known as the Peter principle of the idea of you get to a point of your incompetence level, and then that's where you stay after the point of you just become incompetent at your role. And particularly for that kind of C-suite problem of they're so far detached from the realities of what's going on. I have before solved this by basically managing to get FaceTime in front of them and being their almost their vision point to what's going on the ground. The closer you can get to executive buy-in, like you can often be that truth speaker to them as well. Like treat them as if because fundamentally they report to revenue, they report to shareholders, and they report to a few others, particularly in large companies. If you can basically say, this is the story we're telling, and make that compelling, you basically play DevRel at them. This is the internal version of DevRel, which happens way more often than we want to admit, where you basically have to teach people what your own product does. And often what your own story really is. And this is, if the larger the company is, this is more of your role than you often think it is. You're often more internally facing than externally facing. I'd love to talk more about this because this is what my first job turned into.
Most excellent then. Well, a huge round of applause for Ben, please.